Hey guys, it's Ed, and today, it's time we talk about BloodBorne, my actual first Souls game. Now I know I said the same thing in the Dark Souls 3 review, and truth be told, the only reason I said that was because I haven't thought about BloodBorne in a very long time, and I partially forgot that it existed. Not because I disliked it or anything, quite the opposite. When I got it, I think I beat it 10 or so times. It's more so a out of sight, out of mind type thing, with all the hype games coming out over the more recent years. When I initially played it, I thought it was one of the best games ever, but now, after playing every Dark Souls game, Elden Ring, and Sekiro, I was curious where it would stack up, and having replayed it, I feel I came away with some interesting opinions on it. Some I know I definitely wouldn't have had I reviewed it all those years ago. As I always say with these, I'm gonna voice my opinion on this game. I'm not gonna blindly hate it or love it, I'm just gonna talk about how I feel about it. And with that out of the way, let's begin. The world of BloodBorne is a grim gothic place, full of monsters and men alike. It's visually amazing. I'd argue that this game looks better than DS3 and even ER at times. But at the same time, it feels somewhat samey once you go through it enough. You go from big dark gothic cathedral to big dark gothic church to big dark gothic building throughout a majority of the game, with this only really being broken up by Castle Canehurst, the DLC locations, and Rom's area. Again, the game looks great and I wouldn't get it confused with any other Souls game, but if you were to show me random pictures of areas in this game with no other context, I most likely wouldn't be able to tell you their names specifically like how I could with the other games, with locations like Sen's Fortress or Shrine of Amana. They just feel like they're missing some aspects to help really visually differentiate them. As for game-wise, this game's world is interconnected like Dark Souls 1, with many areas weaving in between each other. As I said in that video, it really makes you appreciate and understand how to get around this world. To the point where when I came back to play it for this video after not even touching the game for 4 years or so, I subconsciously remembered exactly where to go and how to progress the story. And that's extremely impressive. You may think we're jumping into the meat and potatoes of this game pretty early, but I feel to make a lot of my further points, this is pretty much necessary. The combat of this game is fast-paced. It's pretty much Dark Souls 1 at 3 times speed. Heavy and medium rolls aren't even a thing. Pretty much all the weapons swing fast or have fast attack variants. This game is about being aggressive, dodging, and trading attacks with enemies. For DS3 and onward Soul players, you may think this is normal, but the only games out at this point were Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, and the latest game at the time was Dark Souls 2, the slowest one combat-wise. So this became kind of a turning point, and also why a lot of people blame this game for the direction the other games ended up taking. But for me, this led to a lot more exciting encounters, aggressive back and forth matches between you and whatever you're fighting. Then there's the other two unique factors about BloodBorne's combat. First, you'll start with and have a tool to parry bosses with practically at all times, with your pistols, blunderbusses, or rifles, which helps push this more aggressive in-your-face gameplay style. And to complement that, as long as the enemies are roughly human-sized, and sometimes even when they aren't, they can be parried. It feels amazing to throw all these things off guard with your pistol shot and then land the visceral animation. Probably one of the most rewarding attacks in the game. From the sound design to the insane amount of blood that sprays out of the creature you rip your hand out of, it just feels amazing. But my only problem with this game's parry is how often I end up trading a hit with the boss to parry them, just due to the fact that unlike Dark Souls or Sekiro, the attack's hitbox doesn't immediately disappear. So often you get hit just as they stagger. And that alone would probably make this one of the worst Souls games ever, if it wasn't for the rally system. Whenever you lose health in BloodBorne, you're able to fight back and regain all the health you lost recently, which again pushes you into a more aggressive playstyle. So even when you end up trading with the boss, a visceral will always bring your health back up. And later in the game, it could even give you bonus health. Once you get good at this game's combat, you can pretty reliably get good chunks of your health back after eating a hit or two from a boss. One of the many caveats to this that many people bring up is that it somewhat affects the difficulty. After all, in all the other Souls games except Dark Souls 2, your main way of getting health back was an Estus or an Estus equivalent, but the other ways either being very limited or situational. Having a way to effectively gain all of your health back at all times does, as I said, make it very easy to negate a good portion of the damage the enemies do to you, and it also does make a very tangible difference on how you play, as you will be a bit more reckless here than you would be in Dark Souls or Dark Souls 3. Although I'd argue you're only getting the most out of this combat system if you have it learned thoroughly. After all, this system is not useless to someone who wants to back away and safely heal during encounters, so I feel it's fine. All this combines to make a very high-octane Souls action game, and I'm saying all this to prep you for my next 2 points. Enemies in BloodBorne are significantly better than the enemies in Dark Souls 3, as you have an actual threat to deal with. But unlike Dark Souls 1, it doesn't ever feel like there's a spike where the enemies become the main issue of the game. They all have fair attacks, telegraphs, and ways for you to answer to what they do. Hell, with your long-range counter option in your pistol, if enemies decide to wildly flail at you, which would usually be a problem in these kind of games, you'll always have a way to open them up, even safely. All these attributes help a majority of them feel like they never cheat. Now, you may be wondering why I didn't say all, and that's because a wee portion of them feel feel genuinely awful to go against. Now let me preface what I'm about to say with this. This doesn't ruin the game. The enemies I'm about to talk about are very few and far between, but I feel with just how annoying they were, it'd be wrong of me to not mention them. First off, the DLC Sharkman. I'm not going to dwell on these for too long because I'm sure a majority of you have heard about them by now. They have multi-attacks that can pretty much chain to kill you, ginormous hitboxes, a big health pool, and the room that forces you to fight two of them is arguably the worst in the game if you don't use the Bone Blade method. Then let's talk about hunter fights. Keep a note when I say this, I'm not talking about fights like Gascoigne or Gurman, just the basic hunters you run into from time to time. As this is the fast-paced Souls game, the thought of fighting another hunter is exciting, until you actually do it. You can hit stun them as they have no poise, meaning you can straight R1 mash 50% of their health bar out, if not kill them the moment they get close to you. Making it so the moment you can do this, you'll just jump in their face and start pummeling them to death, trivializing the entire point of the encounter in the first place. And for the outlier hunter fights where you can't do this, they're arguably some of the worst encounters in the game. Why? Because they tend to have infinite blood bullets, which you don't, meaning they can do a lot of cheesy shit. The minigun hunter in the DLC comes to mind, who will just hold gunfire down on you, wait for you to pop out for half of a second, and then do it again. Maybe this wouldn't be so annoying if he was in an area you could run around in, but you find him in a cave, and the entrance. This isn't really an option. Second is the hunter trio. I feel it speaks for itself. 3 fast enemies who can gank and kill you in a matter of seconds. This isn't Dark Souls 2 Grave Robbers, as at least there the combat speed was slower, so them opening you up was fairly difficult. The only reason I feel this wasn't downright disgusting for me on my replay of this game was because I managed to just run away from them and pick them off one by one in the weirdest, most non-intended feeling way possible. Although the worst example for a hunter fight I feel you will 100% understand if you played through this game thoroughly is the Cainhurst hunter at the end of Eileen's quest. It's just downright unfair. What I said before does still stand. He has no poise since that's not a thing here, so you can wail on him. Problem is, he has so much health you'll most likely never be able to kill him that way. And he's way over leveled for the point of the game you fight him at. So he can kill you in 3 or so good hits. He's auto-coded to stagger you with his repeating pistol at times, so if he's one-handing, there's a good chance you might just immediately eat shit. The repeating pistol by itself does a good chunk of damage, he never runs out of bullets and he can always pressure you with it. Overall, it feels like you have to cheese just to beat him. Funnily enough, this was the most infamous part of the game for me while I was replaying it, just because it's so comically bad and annoying when put against everything else in this game. Again, just to make sure we're all clear here, this doesn't ruin the game or anything, it's only like 2% of encounters. But I'd be mad at myself had I not brought them up due to how upsetting they are and how they break up the pace of things. BloodBorne bosses are interesting. I wouldn't call any of them bad. At their worst, they're kind of bland throwaways like the Witches of Hemwick or the One Reborn. But at their best, pretty average. Don't get me wrong, they're obviously leaps and bounds better than Dark Souls 1 and 2 bosses. But in comparison to Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, they don't feel exactly the hardest. As in comparison to those games, you have a lot going for you. You can rally against them as I mentioned before, parry a modest portion of them, and the new mechanic in limb breaking lets you do massive damage to them at times. On top of that, their movesets here don't feel super varied or difficult to dodge around. Gurman was a letdown on my replay because I watched him by nigh mashing shots. Lady Maria was pretty much the same experience, which, funny sidebar for a moment. On one of my Elden Ring videos, someone told me Lady Maria and Melania were about the same difficulty-wise, which, what? Cleric Beast, Amygdala, Yharnam Shadows, I plowed through all of them. Even Lawrence and Ludwig, 2 bosses I used to despise fighting. Coming back now, I practically destroyed them. When I think back to this game, I can usually remember the bosses' set pieces, transitions, designs, and sometimes even their themes. But the fights themselves never particularly stuck out in my mind as amazing encounters, and I feel that's a shame. Maybe this feeling is because this was my first ever Souls game, and I've run through it so many times and I just got good, as the community says. But at the same time, I've never felt this meh about a majority of the fights in any of the other games. They hit this weird spot in between DS2 and DS3, where they somewhat still feel like checkpoints in your journey, but they have just enough difficulty where it's an actual fight where you have to learn their moves. However, once you master them, they can't really do much else to surprise you or catch you off guard. Now you may notice, I said most. There's still a single fight I'd rank to be the hardest out of any Souls game, and that's Orphan of Cause. Orphan's sporadic nature, dragging hitbox if you dodge wrong, and insane second phase leads to him being the fight I always struggle with when I play this game, no matter how many times I come back to it. His moveset plays perfectly into your fears. He has many moves that set you up so you feel like you can roll, but he'll immediately hit you again. He'll drag his hitbox with quite a few of his attacks, as I said before, so you'll need to know where to dodge and when to dodge. And his quick speed makes it so you can't stay on top of him. My single and only real complaint with him is he has the same issue Morgott does. Moving so far away at times you need to wait for him to be close to hit him again. NPCs in this game are arguably the weakest out of any Souls game, which is a real damn shame considering you have to, or at least should want to, try and save a good clump of them before the blood moon drops. But unfortunately, they just aren't interesting. They're common folks. I believe they're here to show how the general population feels about the beast, but unlike the other Souls NPCs, they don't have any wider ties to anything else. The only two that break that kind of are the prostitute, since she has ties to Canehurst, and the healing church member. But even with them, it's more subtle and underlying due to it just being allegiances and lineage, not due to what they do specifically. This is in contrast to Lucatiel, Vengarl, Siegward, Sigmire, Morn, Cyrus, etc. You could understand who they were and what they wanted just by following their quest lines. Here, most of the characters are one note. Now this isn't me saying all of them are bad. There's two I do like in particular. Eileen, which I feel like don't need to say much about her if you've played the game, as she seems to be one of the most iconic characters from it, and the other is the abhorrent beast, the man who disguises himself as a human and then transforms, eating your people until you stop him. Although a problem I have with him is he has literally no lore. He's just a guy who's plopped down into the story. He has no quest line, we can't learn anything else about him, he's just there. And the worst part about that is he's probably my favorite beast design in this game, if not in general, with his fur flowing with the lightning and all that. But it is what it is, I guess. I guess as a counterpoint, you could argue DS2 kind of had this problem with a ton of characters lying around with nothing larger behind them. I feel the reason I didn't mind as much is because I felt all these characters had interesting stories to tell us. They all came from different places seeking answers. But the game simply didn't let them tell them, which was disappointing but fine. Here, a few characters don't even have names. Builds here are interesting. They're not at Dark Souls 2 level, but they're more impactful than Dark Souls 3 builds. There's a lot fewer hunter tools than there are magics, but similar to Dark Souls 1, those tend to be very efficient. Something like Augur immediately comes to mind. A relatively high damage attack that can also parry, and if done from behind, force an enemy into a state you can visceral them. The weapons here feel very unique, as I'm sure you've heard of by now. Of course, there's the main defining factor of trick weapons that switch movesets depending on what mode they're in, but depending on your build, you can go from using a sentient club, literal worm hands, or becoming a beast yourself, with your character transforming and gaining a unique moveset still being a feature that's only found in this game. I'm not going to sugarcoat it and pretend you're playing an entirely different game depending on what build you have, as you're most likely still going to be R1ing and parrying enemies to death, but it's still nice to have. BloodBorne has very few complaints against it, and as always, it's only fair that we go over them. Blood Vials. Blood Vials are the Estus equivalent of this game. The healing items you'll always have, for the most part. You see, unlike Estus, Vials don't recharge upon respawn. They're a finite resource you'll either need to find or buy more of, meaning if you get walled by any area or boss and end up burning through resources, they don't just come back, meaning you'll have to farm blood echoes or enemies who drop blood vials just to get back to what you actually want to do. It's a real pain in the ass and probably the worst aspect about this game. I can't really defend it. It's cool that you can pick up more blood vials from enemies, but I really don't think this trade was worth it. Bosses are too big and lock-on can't track them. This is personally a problem I had when I originally started with the game too, with bosses like Parl driving me absolutely insane because the camera wanted to focus on everything but him. However, on my replay, it wasn't so bad. The lock-on system feels like it's only made for moderately sized bosses. Blood-starved beast-type creatures and below the camera will track just fine. Anything larger, it's better to take a monster hunter approach and just angle the camera by yourself. It sounds kinda complicated, but it really isn't that bad as the larger bosses don't move that fast. I feel the main reason so many have said this is just because 99% of other games lock-on actually locks on, so it's not as much of a complaint as more of a weird gimmick you just need to get used to here. Not being able to map the jump button. This is my complaint that will annoy me no matter what time I play the game. You can't map the jump button onto L3. It always stays mapped to running and hitting circle. I cannot begin to explain how many times I jumped by accident trying to dodge an attack and just ate shit for it. It's not even a super big problem, it's just mildly annoying every time it happens, and that's the worst part about it. You'll be having fun with the game and then accidentally jump and groan because you forgot about this entirely. Chalice dungeons. Most people just don't like their existence. Samey roguelike dungeons that reuse the same assets over and over again with little variation. Bosses get reused, and some enemies just get boss health bars slapped onto them. I kinda love it, to be honest. Yeah, I get why people don't love them for the reasons I listed above, but at the same time I don't get why this is such a bad feature for most. It's far removed from the base game, so you'll never accidentally walk into it or be forced to do any of them for main or side story progression. You understand the main function of them is grinding levels inside or blood gems and not finding new weapons and hunter tools, so you won't ever waste your time expecting to find any of those and not getting them. Even if you wanted to counter me and bring up the Madman set or the Beast Claws, they have fixed locations, so you know exactly where they are when you go searching for them. The reuse of bosses and basic enemies don't bother me too much personally. It's not like Elden Ring where you explore the main world and accidentally bump into Estelle again. This feels more like a side dungeon crawler mode, so it made sense to me. And also I feel many tend to discredit the exclusive bosses here. I wish I saved the footage of it, but one time I ran into the Bloodletting Beast, and he was so tall he barely fit in the room. He was bigger than anything I'd seen base game, and honestly, as cringy as this sounds, it felt awesome to take that big of a monster down. The abhorrent beast in base game can be completely avoided in multiple ways, and even if you do trigger him, he can be cheesed really easily. I ran into him in one of the dungeons and I found out he honestly might be one of my favorite fights in the game. The Perthernium Descendant and Elder, the Watchdog of the Old Lords, the Bloodletting Beast as I mentioned earlier, they're good fights and it would be a shame to just have that content cut because they didn't have anywhere else to put them. It has a few stinkers too, of course, but the base game also does, so I'm not particularly mad at that. It feels like having a dungeon randomizer side mode in the Souls game without mods. It gives you more bosses to fight without ever knowing who's next. Souls-inspired designs and architecture that can change every time you go through them, leading to some unique and incredible sights that can only be found in the dungeons. You get technically infinite playtime. I don't see what's wrong with it. I understand some people don't play these games expecting a roguelike element, so many didn't like it at all, but I think it's really fun the more you get into it, especially if you're already into the genre as I am. The game's locked at 30 FPS. Can we be honest? This isn't some huge issue that destroys the game. 60 FPS, 90 FPS, however how you want to go would be nice, obviously. But it's the equivalent of me saying better graphics would make the game better. It helps, but it doesn't drag down the quality of what's here. Overall, BloodBorne is a good game that I still enjoy to this day. However, it's not the flawless, amazing game I remember it being. It's honestly hard to write some deep conclusion for this one. It's just a great game. It's not mind-blowingly good, but it felt like it never had any parts that hard snagged it down for me. Unlike pretty much every other main Souls game, which tended to have one part that could drag down the entire experience. This is a solid ride through and through, and I'd recommend anyone, especially fans of Dark Souls 3 and onwards, give it a play if they can. I almost guarantee you'll love it like me and many others have. Yharnam has its own unique flair when compared to the other Souls games' locations, and I feel like you'd love to explore this world too. But with that, I feel that's all I had to say. As long as you're respectful, I'm glad to discuss with you guys in the comments, and I've been in, and I am out.